Hello, this is Jim Schwab, manager of the Hazards Planning Research Center at the American Planning Association. I'm going to introduce a panel for this discussion in just a second, but this taping is part of a blog that we have done for the Planning for Post-Disaster Recovery Next Generation project that APA is doing for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, that's going to result in sometime in the first half of 2014 in a new PAS report that basically is rewriting the original report on post-disaster recovery from 1998. We're here at the Natural Hazards Workshop in Broomfield, Colorado, and this is a great opportunity to meet a number of the key practitioners in this whole field of natural hazards. And so I'll start to my right with Cathy Prudhomme, who is with the National Fire Protection Association, but has prior experience out here in Colorado with the Colorado Springs Fire Department. She can talk a little bit about some of her local experience as well as experience with the state of Colorado in emergency management affairs. And then to my immediate right is Don Elliott. Don is a longtime zoning practitioner and consultant with Clarion Associates in Denver. Has worked with numerous communities on a variety of development code issues and worked on a project with the National Fire Protection Association on codes relevant to controlling wildfire threats. And then to my left is Tim Gelston, who coordinates community planning and capacity building, recovery support function number 1 for Region 8 of the Federal Emergency Management Agency here in Colorado. Also had a long deployment in New Jersey with the Sandy recovery operations. And we're here to talk about specifically recovery from wildfires. So the first question I'm going to pose to the panel, and you can decide who wants to respond first, is what is unique about recovery from wildfires as distinct from any other kind of disasters? What are some of the unique features that we have to worry about?
I've been thinking about this question a little bit, and you know, so I'm going to get fumble a little bit, but looking for the right words, I think, to express what the difference is. Obviously, at the very basic level, it isn't different, right? It causes property damage. It's fairly unpredictable in terms of its start, although I think we can map it pretty well. I think we know where those areas of vulnerability are going to be, pretty much predict that. And curiously, land development practices seem to want to put more people in those vulnerable areas. It's kind of that quixotic thing with our land development world that we perhaps it's just driven by the market. We enjoy living in places that maybe tend to have a higher vulnerability. So from the federal perspective of response and recovery, I think I would say that the players are different, especially in the recovery world. There are different federal agencies, different processes, different programs that come to bear. I don't really know. Maybe Cathy, you would know. Of the efficacy of those programs versus maybe those aimed at flood events or not. But
well, I think one of the things that's unique is the human dynamic of that. A lot of times, and we'll focus in specifically on Waldo Canyon and Colorado Springs. Even though the city for more than a decade before the fire had gone to neighborhoods and talked about mitigation and risk, and you're in an area that's impacted, down to the scale of identifying by individual address what their level of risk was, there were people in that community that really were still, I'll just say, in denial that there was a risk. It's that we have curbs and gutters and sidewalks and street lights, and my neighbor is literally 3 feet away from me. How could I have a wildfire risk? So for their recovery, you had a group of people who were still in denial that there would ever be a wildfire or that they had a risk. So, you have people who accept that risk and understand it and mitigate it, or you have another group, a large part of a population that say, I live in an urban area. The grocery store is, a half a block away. How can I have a wildfire risk? So I think that does add a little bit of a different element in there, because you have people that didn't even understand that they were in an area that was vulnerable.
Just add one other
Sure.
thing, and I think that's the insurance scene too. With a flood, I think folks who are vulnerable to flooding events have a much higher understanding of the importance of insurance, whereas for fire events, I think we often take it for granted that our insurance coverage covers what's damaged in that event, and I think, and I've been told that that's more likely the case, that your homeowner's insurance carries that fire rider and you don't need that extra coverage. So it's, as a result, the aftermath is often, there's a higher level of insurance and a higher level of support and resource there for communities.
Great.
Okay, well, Tim, you've had some experience with this new National Disaster Recovery Framework. Obviously more in the context of Hurricane Sandy, but you're out here in Region 8. I wonder if you have some thoughts on how we can best apply this NDRF structure in the context of wildfires.
We've had 2 years of pretty horrific wildfire activity here in Colorado and the Intermountain West, really. And in those 2 years, the first year, of course, the NDRF was out, the National Disaster Recovery Framework was out. There was I think, an impulse and perhaps eagerness to get the NDRF, and one of the ideas in the NDRF is a federal disaster recovery coordinator position, or somebody who's going to help kind of coordinate the landscape of federal agencies and presumably recovery activities at the federal level as they roll to the state and to the local level. In both years that happened, an FDRC was identified, appointed. It's been kind of curious that, at least from my perspective, the activities of the agencies involved have seemed to have the capacity to address the events that occurred and the damage that occurred. Which isn't to say there's not a role for the FDRC. I think that role of coordinating across a broad field of stakeholders is a good one, and I think Colorado certainly learned from that, and they have a corollary to the federal disaster recovery coordinator and their state disaster recovery coordinator, and I think they've been very useful at bringing the disparate parties again to the table and helping them understand and share resources. I think there's a lot of promise that in the NDRF that we haven't explored yet. There are certainly ways and other agencies to potentially bring to the table who might have resources. And I think that's, the road going forward is understanding what those opportunities are and getting those folks working in those programs to understand that maybe there's a place for them at the table too, and there's a reason for them to be there.
Okay. Well, Cathy, I think I'll start with you on this next question, which is, can local pre-planning for recovery from wildfires help in any way with communities, and what might that look like?
Honestly, from my experience at the local and state level, I can tell you that there's no finger pointing here. It's a matter of resources and funding. And I have to say, in my experience, there has been little communication and education with residents about recovery. What does recovery even entail? What does it mean? What are the traumas that come with that? So again, I think it's a resource issue that nobody really has a staff or somebody that can talk about that topic. If we're going to dedicate the 1 or 2 small resources that we have, we're going to talk about preparedness and mitigation, not recovery.
Right.
But the funny thing about that is I think if we add recovery into that mix of conversation, that increases preparedness and mitigation. Because people don't understand all that comes with recovery. They don't understand the social issues, the emotional issues, the financial hardships. So maybe if we were able to incorporate that into preparedness and mitigation, it could impact recovery.
Yeah, which leads to my follow-up question, which is whether that can or should be part of the preparation of community wildfire protection plans under the...
I just think having watched and lived for the past decade educational efforts on wildfire mitigation and preparedness, that is one piece that we haven't had the luxury of looking at. And that I do think that in all components of that if we could illustrate and visualize for people what it's like after the event, that would maybe engage them a little bit more on the front end. I do think that's an important piece.
Well, and I would add most of my practice is related to writing codes, and most of them are related to prevention. And the big problem in prevention is that, you approve 2% of your housing stock a year, and the other 98% is already there. So how are you going to reach the 98% that are probably 90 of that 98 do not meet what the standards would be today? Right. And I think it would be good in the pre-planning stage to just let everybody know up front, when you're damaged and you're rebuilding, we are going to enforce all of these requirements regardless of the degree of damage to your house, so that they understand most of the time it would just prepare them for that fact. But from a local government point of view, the last thing you want to do is to be approved rebuilding in the same form that just burned. And I think the public can understand that. No, if God forbid my house burns, I will understand when the government says, no, you're going to have to rebuild this as a new house, the way we would approve a new house today and maintain it that way.
I'm just going to say that there's an interesting story out of Colorado Springs for last year, and that one of the homeowners associations had a set of covenants and deed restrictions that required shake shingle roofing. And of course, in the aftermath of the event, we can look at that and say, well, how silly was that? But 20 years ago or 15 years ago, when they went through and did the final development plan for that, and when the planning commission was sat in their dais and agreed that this was a good thing and they were going to go ahead and approve it, they probably didn't think about that. But that's and I think that's the place where community planning can really provide that kind of linkage and assistance to mitigation. Pre-disaster mitigation early on. So.
Yeah, well, let me follow up with you, Don, at this point, which is getting into those codes. What kinds of local development code provisions do you find are effective in mitigating wildfire threats?
Well, we did a study with NFPA last year to look at this, reviewed lots of communities, not only sophisticated, but those in conservative and unsophisticated, fairly small government communities, to say what works. The answers came back pretty clear. Number one, fire-resistant roof, not a flammable roof. Number two was defensible space, and that's the clear message. If you had to do two things, you would enforce that, and you would be extremely strict about saying when you touch your roof to fix it or expand it or repair it, you're going to put on a fire-resistant roof. Defensible space is harder, and I can talk more about that if you want. After the Waldo Canyon fire, we've heard more. There's been a lot of analysis of that, and I would add at that point kind of 3 and 4. Decks turned out to be a big problem, and decks are expensive, but they're not expensive as rebuilding a house. So I think number 3 on my list would be fire-resistant decks, and number 4 would be making sure that the fire doesn't get into the roof of the building through soffits and grid. I mean, that's Don Elliott's. If I had to say what 4 things would I say you ought to do first in your code, those are the ones. I will say in the same breath that I was up talking with Boulder, I was up listening to a presentation of how Boulder City is going to update their codes, and they have had on the edges of Boulder City wildfire risks. They're almost certainly just going to move to complete sprinklering of the houses. And yes, it's $3,000. Yes, or 4 or 5. Yes, it's a percentage of the housing cost. To be honest, in a group of homeowners, that would be extraordinarily unpopular. I got to tell you, in the Boulder Planning Commission, they say people spend more than that deciding what they blow more money than that on their carpet choice. We're going to take away the choice of carpet and say no, you're going to spend that money on the sprinklering, and then if you've still got money, you can choose a better carpet. So. Yeah,
and 2 of those things you mentioned between the soffits and eaves and so on, and the decks, both introduce that classic problem of updraft that brings the fire into the home, and then you're gone.
Well, that was the lesson I got, and I'm not a firefighter, but from the presentations from people who have studied and studied and studied the Waldo Canyon is they burned from the top down.
Yeah.
And they burned when the roof or the fire got inside the roof of the house. If it burned the deck, it may still burn the house, but there are cases in which the decks did burn and people were able to get them off, or they did limited damage. So what you really don't want to have is have it get on the roof or in the roof.
Right, right. Or into the attic.
Yeah.
So let me follow up here with the question about, obviously you've suggested a number of things that communities can do. They don't all do them. So is there some sort of, do we find some kind of resistance in communities to adopting these kinds of codes, and what might be sort of the source of that resistance? If it's out there, what can we do to overcome that?
Well, I think a lot of people that move into WUI areas, one probably the best example is the Black Forest Fire that was just a month ago.
Yeah, you might want to explain what WUI is.
Sure. The Wildland-Urban Interface, when people make those choices to live there, and the WUI is where development meets developed areas or forested areas, is that construction is not always recent construction. You might have cabins that were built in the late 1800s and vacation homes and mobile homes, and then in the last 10, 15, 20 years, you've had big development where there's people who have $1 million plus homes in there. So you have this mixture of demographics and psychographics that live in that area, and their value systems are very different. Those people that moved there maybe in the 60s or 70s moved specifically to those areas because there were no codes or no ordinances. And they didn't want to see their neighbors or meet their neighbors, and they kept the vegetation there for that screening purpose. So that value system is so different. But without coming in and using some recent fires as educational opportunities and create that top of mind awareness about how maybe back then those were acceptable not to do anything and to keep the tree in the middle of your deck that you've built the deck around and all those other issues. But use some of those recent fires as educational opportunities, that we are evolving and fire risk is growing, and working on changing those mindsets and those behaviors and attitudes.
Okay, either of you have anything to add?
Well, I would add a little bit more about, I would agree with everything Cathy said. And there's self-selection, I choose to live where there's very little government to tell me what to do.
Yep.
And lo and behold, there's very little government to tell me what to do. But I think covenants are a new area. As I mentioned earlier, the real issue in my mind, the real risk reduction frontier, is figuring out how to deal with the homes that have already been built. We know how to build fire-resistant homes today. That's not the problem. The problem is the ones that are already there. So what's your hook to do that? They're very resistant to the government telling them to do that. However, governments could work on covenants. For example, we know now that if you write a racially restrictive covenant, the state's courts are you're not going to be able to enforce that in court. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. Some states have done that with backyard clotheslines, saying we think people ought to be able to dry laundry in their backyard, and we're going to say you cannot enforce those in the state courts. There's no reason you couldn't say you're not going to be able to enforce shake shingle roofs. You're not going to be able to enforce these things in the state courts and get the state involved in saying no. Because I think homeowners have less of a resistance to covenants. They bought the house. The covenants were on the house. It's not big bad government. You chose to buy this house subject to these restrictions. And I think defensible space is the number one thing to put in there, is to say we can try to review and say, all right, you don't want big bad government enforcing this on you because of your political conservative leanings, but here's the deal. Your covenants are going to have to include things like defensible space enforceability.
Sure. Actually, let me follow up for just a second. Didn't Colorado pass some legislation just a few years ago that was invalidating some of those covenants that got in the way of fire safety?
Not fire safety. They did invalidate certain covenants, but it was more on the sustainability front. So, but the problem is the covenants are still in place, so we need to work on them. But I still think that's the angle. I do think that citizens are much less politically resistant when their homeowners association tells them they have to do it. They don't like it, but it's not the elected officials. They don't think it's communism. I joined this club,
Right. Exactly.
Well, I was just going to add that I think the insurance industry is a player here too, and I think as we experience more of the fires, there's going to be more of a move on their part to reduce their risk and enforce or require certain activities on private property. And I think it's just a matter of time before before homeowners start to feel that pressure. I know my neighbor took out 26 trees off his property, largely because his insurance company told him that if he didn't, they wouldn't insure it.
Well, and I think
That's a big hammer.
I totally
That is a big
agree.
hammer.
And when we did our research around the country, we found several, not all, but several of the communities that responded saying our most effective thing is when we started inviting insurance guys around with us. Because even though they turn us off because we're the government, they understand that, you know, the one thing you don't want is a premium increase, but the one thing you really don't want is to find out you're not covered.
Right.
Because of something you did that it was not permitted under your insurance. So.
Okay. Well, let's close this out with one final question, which is how can local government better prepare citizens for these challenges of wildfire recovery that we've been discussing? Any thoughts on that?
I think I have to reflect back to what we talked about before. If we're really talking about recovery, is helping illustrate the long-term effects of that disaster, especially wildfires. Right now, in Manitou Springs, there's massive flooding related to the wildfire. Last summer, all those people thought about was the wildfire missed us. We were evacuated for about 48 hours. We came back to our homes. We dealt with a little bit of smoke. And even though emergency management in that county has talked about flooding, they've done activities to have community sandbag filling days and instructions on how to build and stack the sandbags around your home. Last summer, as soon as the fire was out, there could have been some media, and maybe there was, and I'm just not aware of it, but that this is the next thing to expect. The fire's out, but here's the next thing that you're going to have to deal with.
And there's no vegetation left to absorb all that water.
Exactly.
Right. Well, great. Thank you all for your participation in this discussion. It's been very informative for our audience, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.